Greetings, APS 2022. I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person, but I'm delighted to join this symposium and talk to you about perceptual confounds in emotion perception as a function of gender. When I discovered what my colleagues in this symposium are going to be talking about, I actually collected some new data, and I have to qualify my title. This may not be true across race. Some of the new data that I'll be presenting was collected with the help of one of our most talented PhD candidates, Christina Lewis, in the Human Systems Engineering program here at ASU. I'm indebted to her work. Several researchers have produced evidence that we are biased to perceive men as angry and women as happy. I'll be talking about some of the research that I and my colleagues have done, but there are others that have produced these effects as well. We have suggested that this stems from a perceptual confound. The cues for masculinity overlap with the cues for anger. For example, the lowered brow, and the cues for femininity overlap with the cues for happiness, like neotinous qualities of the female face. In fact, that may be backwards. I really think that it's the cues of anger and the cues of happiness that overlap with gender, but we'll get to that in a moment. There's also plenty of evidence that Black men are stereotyped as angry. Surprising new evidence suggests that these expression gender confounds are primarily seen in Caucasian faces, and moreover, that the same methods do not show that male anger concordance in Black faces. Consider a very simple task that we published in JPXP back in 2007. We just asked people to identify whether a face was angry or happy, and we presented faces from the Ekman and Friesen stimulus set, 6 males, 6 females. In this study, we were able to show that when you look at reaction time, people are much faster to identify anger on a male face relative to a female face. And they're much faster to identify happiness on a female face relative to a male face. And when you look at hit rates, they show a complementary pattern. People are more accurate to identify anger on a male face relative to a female face, and more accurate to identify happiness on a female face relative to a male face. Intriguingly, this pattern also replicates if you ask people about the gender of expressive faces. When you see a result like this, it's important to ask, is this a property of the perceiver, the receiver of the signal, or the signal itself? We did a variety of other studies and concluded that it's not merely a consequence of what's going on in the head of the perceiver. It's not a consequence of stereotypes. It's, in fact, at least in part, a property of the signal. We believe that the facial expression of human anger, which communicates dominance and threat, converged on a form that mimicked another sign of threat, masculinity, and thus capitalized on the pre-existing gender recognition system, which was already cued to be wary of males as more dangerous, more threatening because of their greater upper body strength, in the sexual dimorphism that we see in most hominid species. Conversely, happiness may have evolved to neotinize or feminize a face as a shortcut to conveying approachability or submissiveness. The rounder features were more likely to elicit nurturance, reactions, and thus more likely to lessen an attacker's inclination to clobber us. So a happy face is designed to be rapidly detected and to rapidly make you look like you are not a threat. There's 2 implications of this confounded nature hypothesis that we proposed. One is that facial expression and gender would be perceived integrally. If facial expression evolved to mimic these gender cues, at least in part, probably it's doing other things, but at least in part, the expression of anger is mimicking masculine cues, and the expression of happiness is mimicking childlike or feminine or neotinous cues. That's a much stronger claim that can be tested with something called the Garner interference task. Moreover, if expression evolved later than the things that discriminate faces as a function of sex, gender recognition, then the primacy of gender should interfere more with expression than vice versa. So let's talk about what a Garner interference task is. We have a very similar task to what we were looking at before. Identify whether this face is angry or happy, or identify whether it's male or female. But we have a series of blocks. In control blocks, the level of the second perceptual dimension is fixed. So the angry and happy discrimination is made, but all the faces are made. And then there's another block where they're all female. The second dimension cannot interfere with the primary discrimination because it's constant. Now in other blocks, you do allow this second dimension to vary. So if I'm making angry and happy discriminations, the faces will be either male or female. Here, the second dimension can interfere with the primary discrimination because it is not constant. So if there's what we call Garner interference, it slows down performance. If you don't see any slowdown, then there's no Garner interference. So the inference about interference is made as a function of the overall reaction times in the orthogonal blocks being longer than the reaction times in the correlated block, or in the control blocks. So let's take a look at the results. When we look at people making angry and happy discriminations, there is in fact about a 35 millisecond slowdown relative in the orthogonal blocks relative to the correlated blocks. And when you look at people making male and female discriminations, the exact same task, just a different judgment, so the same stimuli, just a different judgment, you see about a 20 millisecond, but still a statistically significant Garner interference effect. So gender interferes with expression more than expression interferes with gender. So now I want to talk about adding more uncertainty to the detection task. These studies so far look at speed because the images are relatively unambiguous. But what happens when we slow down the evidence accumulation? Blurring the faces is a way to add uncertainty. You can also consider this low-pass filtering. And so this makes the task harder. And the interesting thing about low-pass filtering is that it has been argued that it allows a faster subcortical processing route to take precedence over slower, more deliberative processing. So we first tried this in a dynamic expression task several years ago. We first looked at this in a study of how people detected dynamic facial displays of emotion. So this was a neutral face that would then become happy or become angry. We did this by showing a sequence of images from the Chicago face database. Every 35 milliseconds, it looked like a movie. People thought it was plausibly a dynamical expression. We thought it offered more control about the onset and final state of the expressions rather than filming somebody doing this dynamically. When we look at the results here, we continue to see some of the same effects that we saw. So looking at happy female faces, we see a happy advantage. But one of the things we also did was we looked at high and low pass filtering. We won't spend too much looking at high pass filtering, which focuses on the lines. But when we look at low pass filtering, blurring the image, we saw an increased effect of this happy advantage for female faces. And in fact, there's a general happy advantage even for male faces in this case, because as a face becomes happy, it seems like we are just much more equipped to detect happiness in a dynamic environment. But let's look at some additional uses of this blurring methodology. Christina and I have collected several new studies using this blur methodology or low pass filtering methodology. In 3 of these studies, we have manipulated how much the face is blurred. So here we use the Raudboud expressive face stimuli, because we've already used Ekman, we've used the NIM-STIM, we've used a variety of other images, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to generalize this to a new image set. Here is an example of a 6-pixel blur, and we present this image and we just ask, what is the expression, angry or happy? Here's 8-pixel blur, and here's a 10-pixel blur. As you can see, it gets increasingly difficult to discriminate what these expressions are. We focus on accuracy here. We didn't measure reaction times because we did this in Qualtrics, and at the time, reaction times it was a little dicey to get them to be accurate across different platforms. I've subsequently figured out how to do this, but we just have accuracy in this data set. We transform accuracy, or more specifically the hit rates and the false alarm rates, into signal detection measures of bias, more precisely Macmillan and Creelman C. And we'll also look at D prime as well. First, I'd like to point out that expression discrimination is still manageable with that 10-pixel blur. We can use D prime to see this, and D prime is significantly above 0 even for a 10-pixel blur. But the much more interesting results come when we look at bias. So here I've got Macmillan and Creelman C, and no bias is indicated by that dashed line. No bias is 0. And what you can see is, first of all, there's clearly a greater bias to call female faces happy relative to male faces. So we continue to see the confounded nature effect. There is a general trend to call more blurred faces angry. And although we're not seeing an overall bias to call male faces angry, we do see under the 8-pixel blur a significant bias. And then about 10 pixels, it's picking back up and approaching 0. I suspect that if we went up to 12 or 14 pixels, we would not be able to discriminate these things anymore, and there would be no bias. Now that begs the question, can you detect gender under this manipulation? Intriguingly, in study 2, we also asked people to identify gender, and so you can see here that discriminating male from female, there's good gender discrimination as indexed by D prime. And when we look at the general bias to identify blurred faces as male, people were much more likely to call angry faces male, even if they were female faces. There's a general bias to identify blurred faces as male, but much more of a bias to call angry faces male. Imagine my surprise when I was contacted about the new findings to be presented in this symposium. I realized that I've never tested these effects in black faces. It's strange because I've done plenty of other research with black faces that shows some pretty hefty biases to see anger on at least the male faces. For example, with John Maynor and colleagues, we showed that participants thinking about self-protection projected anger onto neutral black male faces. And with Saul Miller and John Maynor, there were multiple studies that replicated similar effects in social categorization. But all of these involved activating a sense of self-protection or looking at individual differences in aggression avoidance, and I'd never actually done the basic extension that I should to see if this confounded nature effect works in black faces. So hot off the presses, and just for this conference, we have conducted a study of black and white, male and female faces making multiple facial expressions, and we asked people to identify these under a 7-pixel blur. So here I want you to note that we chose faces from the Chicago database, face database that in which happiness was never expressed with a toothy grin, so we didn't have that contrast of the white teeth and a darker complexion. You do have some confounds in the fear expression. Sometimes the mouth there is open. 122 participants, 7-pixel blur. That looks like this. So you can see that you can discriminate both gender and expression a little bit. 5 faces of each race and gender combination. So each participant ran through 80 trials altogether. We also included neutral faces, but no neutral response options so that we could probe biases in a different way. When we look at sensitivity, we first see that indeed, as I had found in the past, discrimination of expressions is higher for the white faces than for the black faces under this blurring manipulation. So that could explain some of the things, but biases, on the other hand, are producing very unusual effects. Let's look first at the right-hand side of this bias graph, where we can see that for white females, at least, there's a bias to call the faces happy and a bias away from calling them angry. There's more of a bias to call white males angry, although it's not different from 0. It's the only thing that's above the 0 line on this Macmillan and Creelman C graph. But when we look over at the black faces, we see pronounced biases to call them happy. No biases to call them angry, though there is a bit of a sex difference for the black females and the black males. So some loose evidence of it, but it's really not compelling. And the bigger effect is that they're being called happy. Now let's look at the neutral faces and what they're called. When we look at the counts of what neutral faces are called, well, black females and black males, there's not really much of a difference. They're equally likely to be called happy, angry, or fearful. But for the white faces, they're much more likely to be called angry under this blurred manipulation. That is very interesting. So, what I have called the confounded nature hypothesis, that angry faces look masculine and happy faces look feminine, seems not to occur for black faces. Instead, there's a pronounced bias to see them as happy, and there's another bias to see white faces as angry. Why is this? Could this be participants seeking to counteract stereotypes? I suspect that it is a function of something that's more primitive, more bottom-up. Maybe the rounder, more neotenous features in African faces are driving the same kind of thing that we propose drives the happy female effect in white faces. But I look forward to what my co-presenters will offer us, and rest assured that I feel like I've got a considerable amount of work to do to now try to figure out if the confounded nature hypothesis really holds in other races once we control for contrast of skin tones and things like that. If it doesn't, then it's not a universally, then it's not an evolutionarily sound hypothesis. So please contact us with questions. You can use my email. And I'd like to thank a variety of funding agencies and folks that worked on the various studies, but especially Christina Lewis, who has done a great job of making sure that this was analyzed correctly. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to what the next presenters are going to talk about.